Warm welcome to Professor Vinelal and my dear colleagues and students, researchers from around the world. When Professor Vinelal was invited as erudite scholar of Kerala Higher Education Council, I was fascinated just by his suggestion to work on a series of lectures on dissent, simply because the notion of dissent is seminal to my academic understanding of the world around us and the political practice we are engaged in. Vinay's work in many ways opens up vistas of initiating a politics of dissent. In 2009, we, a small group of academics, thoroughly disturbed by the emerging hypersensitivity to humanities and arts in India in particular, and everywhere in the world in general, from various quarters, such as, say, politicians, policymakers, intellectuals, I'm sorry, and administrators. We have organized an international conference in Thrissur on the future of humanities and the arts. Um, in The conference was actually to re-examine the role of humanities in the age of digital culture, post-humanist assumptions, post-theory predilections in visual culture, etc. And this was organized under the rubric of under the title of C Praxis. One of the key thinkers in the world, Ashish Nandi, who has been working in the areas related to the central question and problematic of the conference, was invited as the keynote speaker of that conference. Ashish has been a phenomenal presence working simultaneously in many disciplines and interdisciplines for academics and scholars all around the world. His keynote lecture, The Untamed Language of Political Dissent, in 2009, transformed the scope and implications of the conference in an exceptional manner, in a precise way, explicating his dissenting imagination par excellence, and of course, reflecting an intellectual life full of conflicts and turbulences. Of course, his lecture in Thrissur in 2009 was one of many versions of his idea of the language, the untamed language of dissent. He has been consistently developing and elaborating upon. I would say Ashish Nandi was undoubtedly initiating a discourse, say, on the politics and language of dissent, not only on the Indian Eurasian situation, but the past and future of dissent around the world. When Vinay Lal edited a book on the multiple selves and strange destinations of Ashish Nandi, no wonder that he has chosen Dissenting Knowledge's Open Futures as his title. In his introduction to the second edition of this book, Professor Vinay Lal described Ashish as an ultimate dissenter. In Euro-American contours, political dissent is often is an idea that perennially receives much public attention. Standing in academic literature is relatively slight. Very few thinkers engage the idea of dissent outside its manifestation, like as an illegal action, and even fewer dedicate any time to understand the idea conceptually. But uh, let me recall some of the most significant references from Ashish Nandi's lecture on the language of dissent from his 2009 lecture, which is reshaped and rewritten many times, presented many places in the world in accordance with the local, context. This is actually from my notes I have taken down then. He argued that we have tried to specify and content dissent, whether in universities, administration, or in academic circles, etc. We have tried to contain dissent by defining what is good dissent and bad dissent. This implies that we are facing the problem of knowingly or unknowingly bring forth our canons of what is good and bad dissent. On the untamed nature of the language of dissent, Ashish illustrated that the crucial factors which initiate hegemony derived from categories, that is ideas. The justification for dominance comes from a set of values previously were thought emancipatory and liberatorial, such as science, rationality, progress, realism, history, etc. These general words have become out of context and at times source of hatred for the people from the margins, or people who are underprivileged, disenfranchised, and so on. The idea of untamed language actually was the actual source of inspiration for my fascination for Vinay Lal's proposal for a lecture series on dissent that time. Vinay Lal described Ashish Nandi again as someone who defied all attempts to restrain him within the straitjacket of received ideologies. On the basis of, I quote from Vinay Lal's introduction to his edited work on Ashish Nandi, his numerous interventions in the public sphere in India and his efforts across the globe to generate more ecumenical futures, particularly for those who have disenfranchised and silenced. According to Vinay, nearly everyone, Hindu nationalists, liberals, secularists, and purveyors of real politics to the Dalits, Marxists, and feminists, have always a quarrel with Ashish Nandi. Professor Vinay, we are immensely thankful to you for your kindness to engage the Erudite project and to accept the offer as an erudite scholar of the Kerala Higher Education Council. In fact, Professor Vinay Lal has been in constant touch with Kerala and with our institution too. He served as the keynote speaker in the Centennial Conference on Print Modernities in 2019, which was held at St. Thomas College. Another immensely interesting factor is that the context of this international lecture series is that Vinay Lal's book, History of History, is going to be published in Malayalam by DC Books soon. Most of the translators of that volume are in some way or other connected to St. Thomas College. And the editors, me and Dr. C.J. George, a former faculty of St. Thomas College and an eminent linguist, both are connected to St. Thomas College. So I'm so proud to announce the upcoming translation of Vinay Lal's one of the most popular works, History of History, into Malayalam in the near future. So this is actually the preamble of this lecture series on the language of on studies on dissent. And welcome, Professor Vinay Lal, and thank you for your kind presence.
Thank you very much, Professor Biju, for your very interesting remarks. And in fact, to use the word from the program, very erudite remarks about the nature of the work that Professor Nandi has done. Before I launch into my own talk, I would like to thank the anchor, Christina. I would like to add my thanks as well to Dr. Anto Thomas, to Father Martin, K.A., the principal of the college, and the manager, Bishop Tony Leedan-Kavil, for having welcomed me to this program. And my thanks, of course, to the Kerala Higher Education Council for inviting me, courtesy of my friend Biju, to this program. Let me say as well a couple of things by way of a preface. The first is that this particular lecture for today introduces a figure who I think is not really known at all beyond India and Pakistan. In Pakistan, for reasons that we shall turn to towards the end of my talk, there have been reasons to forget him. In India, there may not have been reasons to forget him, but nonetheless, I think even in India, he has become, particularly for this generation and perhaps even the preceding generation, something of a distant memory. Nonetheless, this is not going to be a biographical foray into his life. I don't intend to do that at all. But at the same time, I must say that this talk will not be, I fear, anything along the lines that Professor Biju might be anticipating, perhaps, if I understand the tenor of his remarks, because I'm not really going to be working in the mode today in which I have ordinarily worked. I really want to take a look at the life of Badshah Khan and an organization that he founded. And I think the fact that there is a war going on at the present moment, and a war of aggression that has been unleashed by Russia against Ukraine, I think furnishes the context that we need to understand why some of the insights from the life of Badshah Khan might be important. So that is really by way of a short preface. Before I go any further into this, I'm going to now share a screen, and I hope that endeavor is successful. Let me see if I can find the screen here. All right, here we go. So can the screen be seen? I just want to know.
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. So I don't have to repeat the title of the talk. It's been mentioned a number of times. It's on the screen and in front of everyone. The subject of my talk is this man over here. He's known by many names. And we need to ask, of course, what's in a name? So he's known as Ghaffar Khan, or Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. The autobiography that we have is published under this name, and at birth he was called Abdul Ghaffar Khan. Sometime in his 20s, he came to be known to the Pathans as Bacha Khan, the king of Khans. But in his own native area, I think it is safe to say that he is largely known as Bacha Khan, an affectionate term, which means pretty much what Bacha Khan means, the king of chiefs, but that's really how he's known. Sometimes he's also referred to as a Fakhr-e-Afghan, that is the pride of the Afghans, because as I'm sure most of you know, and I will get to this in the course of my talk very briefly, that when the Durand Line was drawn, which delineated the borders between what was then British India and Afghanistan, and that border still stands, the Pathans were themselves divided. So, of course, outside of India and Pakistan, the other place where he has much of a reputation, at least in some circles, is Afghanistan. In India, he has generally been known as Frontier Gandhi. Now, Ghaffar Khan himself disavowed that term. There's an occasion where he says that, please don't call me Frontier Gandhi, because there is really only one Gandhi. And Gandhi is our leader, and there can be no other kind of Gandhi. But I think that the other difficulties sometimes that we have to think about in thinking of him as a Frontier Gandhi is that there is an implication, perhaps not intended, but an implication that he should be seen as something of an appendage to Gandhi, which is a view that I think we seriously need to disavow. There is no question that he had an extraordinarily close relationship to Gandhi. And in some ways, the two were really a pair, which I think is quite unusual in the annals of world history, I would say, for reasons that, once again, I think will be intimated at in the course of my talk. And then finally, he's also known as Sarhadi Gandhi or Sarhadi Gandhi, which means pretty much the same as Frontier Gandhi, because that's a word for frontier, right? So how we call him is not inconsequential. And in the course of my talk, I shall refer to him largely as Ghaffar Khan, perhaps occasionally as Bacha Khan, and I shall refer to the Pakhtuns or the Pashtos as Pathans, which is a word that is used more often in the Indian subcontinent. And here you see this is actually the cover of a matchbox. This might be transparent to some of you who, if your eyes have move to the bottom of this screen, you see A.E. Macheswala, who was in fact, this was a company that produced matchboxes, and this matchbox is from the 1920s. And here you can see he's referred to as Sarhadi Gandhi, so the frontier Gandhi. And this is an extraordinary woodcut. I'm just giving you some sense of who the man was. There are many descriptions of Ghaffar Khan. He is often described as a giant of a man. He was about 6 feet 3 inches, a very imposing figure. But I think the description of him as giant of a man, of course, extends beyond his physical appearance and demeanor. It is the impression, the extraordinary impression he left on people who came into very close contact with him, and the integrity of his life. I think it will become clear to you in the course of this talk that I hold Ghaffar Khan to be a person in the same league as people like Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela, the people who are usually mentioned. That, if I may put it this way a bit colloquially, is kind of the holy triumvirate of nonviolence that is often routinely mentioned almost mechanically in histories of nonviolence and more recent histories of nonviolence. But I think that there is no question that Badshah Khan or Ghaffar Khan is someone who belongs in that company. This is something that can be described as his motto. I will not read it because the screen is there for you to see. And what I want to really do is I want to translate what you're seeing on the screen into what one might describe as 2 fundamental aspirations that Ghaffar Khan had. The 2 fundamental passions that animated him over the course of 7 to 8 decades, from the time that he became a young man. And those 2 passions were to see a free, democratic, secular, I want to put the word secular in quotation marks for the present moment, a free, secular, democratic, united India. India was, of course, at that point under colonial rule, and to see the prosperity of his own people, right? Of the Pathans, to see them become a free people, but a people who would also be self-reflective about their freedom, right? Who would be prosperous and who would be dignified. This is the essence of his passion. But this talk is not only about Badshah Khan. As the title suggests, the perfect exponent of Satyagraha, a description that was given to Badshah Khan or Ghaffar Khan by Gandhi, but it's also about an organization that he created. And this organization, I think, is an organization that is really without comparison anywhere in the world. It has a short-lived history, fundamentally from 1930 approximately, late 1929, until the advent of independence, until partition, the vivisection of India, and the creation of course, the 2 nation states of India and Pakistan. So this organization is also the subject of my talk, and what you see here is a photograph from the 1930s. The photograph, the exact provenance of this photograph is unknown. I've looked at the 15 or 20 principal books that have been published, and none of them have really given a very close identification of exactly where this photograph was taken or by whom. But it's generally dated to the 1930s, and it shows this organization, the Khudai Khidmatgars, to which I shall turn in the latter half of my talk. And here is another photograph of that. This is from the archives of the Hindu, of the people who were members of this, because to put it very dramatically, it is really the first formulation that I can think of what can be called a nonviolent army. The term itself is, of course, an oxymoron to many people, But that is precisely the purpose why we need to really think about what insights we get from this organization and Badshah Khan's thinking about this organization. Now, to give an understanding to some of you, there may be some of you here who don't know that terrain very well. So I just wanted to, place before you this map here. So where you see my cursor, this is Peshawar over here. And this is the region that we are really speaking about. You will see a number of maps in quick succession, which will show you the location of Ghaffar Khan's birth village or birth town, which is only at a distance of approximately 28 to 30 kilometers from Peshawar. And in the subsequent slides, you will see that. But this gives you a broader indication of, so you can see here, Northwest Frontier Province. So this map, of course, is from the time well before independence. This map is, in fact, actually roughly from around 1900, approximately. And this map here indicates something which I think is important to recognize, although it's really not the subject of my talk as such. It has some bearing if one wanted to do a very detailed study of what one might describe as the aspiration for independence among the Pathans, the aspiration for a homeland for the Pathans. And it has some implications for understanding, of course, the activities of Ghaffar Khan himself. What this map really shows, so it says tribal locations of the Pathans. This map also dates back to the colonial period, is that we often think of course, the Pathans as simply as one community, but we have to think, in fact, of many different tribal communities and groups. And over here, we can see, I have to just move this. Okay, so you see the numbers over here. So this is the region that we are most concerned with today. And if you look at what is numbered here is number 4, Muhammad Zai. So this was the tribe or the Pathan clan, if you want, from which Ghaffar Khan and his family hail. All right. And if you were to go back to this particular slide here for a moment, let me see if I can. Sorry. You would see that there is a substantial division here. So if you look at the Khyber Pass, for example, historically speaking, it's the Afridis that really have been the guardians of the Khyber Pass. So different tribal communities or different Pathan communities have different histories, of course, right? To put it in very simple language here. This here is Utman Zai, which is the place where, so it's north of Peshawar, northeast of Peshawar. This area is an area of extraordinary historical interest. Again, if one were doing, let's say, a series of talks on the Khudai Khidmatgars, the history of Peshawar and Ghaffar Khan, then one would have to entertain some kinds of considerations which I'm not able to do justice to in my talk today. What I mean by that is the following, that this region is a region that is historically extremely rich, because its history before the coming of Islam is a history, of course, of Buddhism and Hinduism, right? So Charshada, that's the area that we're talking about over here. It's also the name of actually a city. It's about, I think, the 85th largest city in Pakistan. This area was part of the what you could describe as Gandharan Buddhism. In fact, it is in some ways the epicenter of it. But there is also a former history of the Hindu presence. Now, some of the biographers of Ghaffar Khan have suggested, without really hinting in what fashion this might be the case, they have suggested that this Buddhist presence, right, had some bearing on his life as well. we would have to ascertain to what extent he was fundamentally interested in it, to what extent he was knowledgeable about it. Rajmohan Gandhi, for example, who wrote a short biography of Ghaffar Khan about two and a half decades ago, hints at this Buddhist presence here and suggests that it was quite important. And of course, I mean, one of the ways in which one can think about the importance of Buddhism here is the idea of ahimsa. But I think that one shouldn't be too mechanical in this exercise. It really has to do with the question of how certain kinds of traces leave an imprint when one is not even fully aware of them, right? I think that one has to begin with that recognition, much in the way in which Freud, when he writes Civilization and Its Discontents, right? So when he's trying to describe his theory of psychoanalysis, and he says that, well, let's begin with archaeology. Let's begin with archaeology. Look at the city of Rome, that you see a layer there, and then underneath that, there is another layer. And underneath that, there is yet another layer. That's what the excavations were showing, layer beyond layer. And sometimes it is these traces. So I'm suggesting the traces of Buddhism, of Hinduism, were also traces of a certain kind of cosmopolitanism and ecumenism in the life of Ghaffar Khan, right? But this is not something that I can really get into in any detail here at the present moment. And so here you see Charsa Daher and Utmanzai, Peshawar, right? So these are the areas. Malakand, I will have occasion to refer to this because Churchill, in fact, actually was part of the Malakand expeditionary force. And, you know, he leaves behind a fairly detailed record. And this was, of course, when he was a young man of his time among the Pathans and in Afghanistan and you know, in this area in the Northwest Frontier province. So moving on then, what is the outline of my remarks of my paper today? Very briefly, so a prologue, which is effectively what I've been doing. I want to talk a little bit about the Northwest Frontier in the colonial period and the idea of the punitive expedition. Then offer some anthropological remarks about the Pathans or the Pashtuns, a brief biographical itinerary into the life of Ghaffar Khan, and then the nexus that develops between the Khudai Khidmatgars and the Indian National Congress, how to locate Ghaffar Khan in relationship to Gandhi. This is far from an exhaustive view. I think that this is something that one needs to have a much more nuanced understanding of. But here, what we're attempting to do is to really enter into the life of Ghaffar Khan and the organization that he created. And then, of course, I will have some concluding observations. Let it be said at the beginning that when we're looking at Badshah Khan, we're looking really at an anomalous figure in the history of Indian/Muslim nationalism. See, if we had to compare him to Mohandas Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, or let's say people from his own, quote, Muslim community. I use that with reservation because I think that, of course, he's a devout Muslim. Jinnah was not even remotely a Muslim, much less a devout Muslim, right? I mean, he's a Muslim, of course, in that he agitates on behalf of the Muslims and then becomes the leader of Pakistan, of Free Pakistan in 1947. But we cannot think of Jinnah in the template of religion, that is to say, unless one thinks about how he instrumentalized religion, which I dare say is the last thing that Ghaffar Khan would ever have done, right? So this is what I mean when I have some reservation when I say that, well, okay, let's also put him alongside some Muslim figures such as Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and then someone with whom he does have much in common, but that's another long history, and that is Maulana Azad. But if you take Jinnah, Azad, Nehru, Mohandas Gandhi, just four figures over here, we see that these people were people who were highly educated, They came from, on the whole, urban and urbane settings, right? Most of them were barristers. They're trained as barristers. A disproportionate number of people who were actually in the Indian National Congress, particularly in positions of leadership. And if you're looking for the history from 1885 until the 1930s, a disproportionately large number of them had legal backgrounds. Right? Now, in the case of Ghaffar Khan, we find that he had very little education. We shall visit the question of his education in a little bit more detail shortly. But comparatively speaking, he had very little education. He doesn't come from Delhi, from Calcutta, from Bombay, from Aligarh. He comes from the frontier. He comes from the rural countryside. The frontier was beyond the pale. Right? He doesn't write at all. The autobiography is in fact actually dictated. It's dictated. It's dictated in Pashto. It's then translated into Urdu and of course translated into English as well. Right? Unlike Gandhi, Nehru, Maulana Azad, who were people who had a national profile and who aspired to be leaders of the nation, Ghaffar Khan never really aspired to be a leader of the nation. He only aspired to represent his fellow Pathans. I think that is fundamentally the case. And this is also going to be one reason why he's going to disavow power. It has sometimes been suggested that even though he was very close to Gandhi and Nehru and was a member of what is called the Congress Working Committee, that he was never really invited to the presidency of the Congress. I don't think that suggestion is correct. From my understanding, he was in fact offered the presidency, but he turned it down. Offered the presidency by no less a person than Gandhi himself. But he turned it down because it was not in keeping with his character. It was not in keeping with his aspirations, with his dreams. And those had very little to do with becoming the leader of a nation. Right? He is a person who consistently disavowed power. Consistently disavowed power. And I think that if we're speaking in that register, this is the other grounds for placing him in close proximity to Gandhi, because I think the only other person of whom it can be said that he also disavowed power in certain ways was, of course, Gandhi himself. So if we look at Ghaffar Khan, we find that barring certain kinds of congruencies between his life, limited congruencies between his life and the life of Gandhi, we find that Ghaffar Khan was a fundamentally anomalous figure in the history of Indian nationalism / Muslim nationalism. Was he even really a Muslim nationalist? He was a devout Muslim. Did he even think, however, in the categories of religion in this fashion, right? And when we look at the vow that volunteers had to take when they joined the Khudai Khidmatgars, we will get to that vow later on. We will get, I think, a reasonably good idea of the fact that he did not really think in these religious categories. Now, when he was eulogized at his death as the greatest non-violent soldier of Islam in history, right? My only reservation with that is soldier of Islam. Did he position himself as a soldier of Islam, as a defender of the faith? And I think that is also extremely questionable, whether he positioned himself in that fashion. Now, what is it that I hope we can do in the course of my remarks today? I want to give you a very broad overview of that before I start moving into very quickly into the different sections of my paper. The Khudai Khidmatgar movement throws up certain kinds of questions for modern social anthropology and history. It throws up a whole set of questions which we are now familiar with, particularly after subaltern studies became one of the dominant ways of looking at the history of modern India. But this KK movement, the Khudai Khidmatgars movement, enables us to look once again at the relationship of elites and subalterns and their relationship in popular movements. Subaltern resistance and the colonial post-colonial state, tribal society and its relationship to the colonial post-colonial state, the relationship between religion and social political protest, the place of violence and non-violence in tribal society. It enables us to give some thought to the question of oral histories, how oral histories are done, what is the epistemology that drives them, what is their relationship to history, ethnography, memory, folklore. And of course, it enables us to gain some insight into the KK, which is how I shall henceforth refer to the Khudai Khidmatgars as a cultural movement and the questions of cultural autonomy that it invoked, right? There are some further considerations here, such as a tension between a segmentary feudal society and provincial national politics, right? But I think, as I've said before, and this I'm adverting here now to what I'd said some moments ago, how does one assess the place of the unsaid in such histories? What bearing did Gandharan Buddhism and the previous history of Charshada, Pushkalavati, that was the earlier name by which it was known, have on Ghaffar Khan and the KK? What are these traces that one can really think about? Now, the Northwest frontier, and I shall really, I shan't go over everything and some of these slides here because it would really take a lot more time than what we have available to us at the moment. But I want to just highlight a few features here, which I think are critical to understanding the emergence of Ghaffar Khan and the Khudai Khidmatgars. So for our purposes, the history really begins in the late 1840s in the aftermath of the Second Sikh War, when the Northwest frontier was absorbed into British India. And you can look at, to use this word anomalous once again now, but in a different context, you can consider how anomalous the Northwest frontier really was. Because the Punjab Frontier Police, which was established to monitor the Northwest frontier, reported directly to the Chief Commissioner of the Punjab. This reporting system was highly unusual. From the 1850s to the 1870s, the Northwest frontier is said to, by people who have really studied what can be described as British policy in this part of India, in this part of British India, is said to have been basically, the frontier in this period is said to have been shaped by what is called the closed border policy. The closed border policy here is intended to be a contrast to, excuse me, let me just get, yeah, it's intended to be a contrast with what is called the forward policy over here that you see here, which was instituted in the 1870s. The forward policy was a policy that was intended to give the British, greater cause for intervention in tribal affairs. So this is in the context of what is called the Great Game, where there is a considerable fear about Russia trying to make inroads. And much of the history of this region can also be understood as an attempt to try to create a buffer zone between British India and Russia. There is a contrast that is made between settled districts and what is called a tribal area. I think this slide over here, I'll go back to the previous slide in just a moment. It's a very simple slide here, but it has the virtue of suggesting very clearly what is the difference between, so you can see the shaded area there, as the key shows you, this is what was called the settled districts, and then the area in white, the unshaded area, is what are called the tribal territories. Much of this corresponds to what gets to be known much later on in Pakistan as FATA, which is a federally administered tribal area. So in order to understand what is transpiring in the late 19th century and into the 1900s, we have to understand that these tribal areas were partially intended in a way as a buffer zone. Okay, of course, in some ways, Afghanistan itself is viewed, portions of Afghanistan as a buffer zone, right, between British India and Russia. And that was in many ways the justification for the line that you see there. So that is the border, that's essentially the Durand line. Now, one thing I do want to highlight here is the Frontier Crimes Regulation, which is passed in 1872, which is a most extraordinary piece of legislation. You did have what we can describe as draconian legislation even in British India. The closest approximation is something that is really known only to historians. It's called Regulation 3 of 1818. The Frontier Crimes Regulation, if one had to put it in very simple terms, what it did was it placed the frontier entirely outside the realm of settled law, outside the realm of the judiciary. What it did was it essentially gave the British a free hand to do what they wanted. You could, the writ of habeas corpus is essentially suspended. People could be imprisoned, not brought before a magistrate for years, right? But it also did such things as impose collective fines, something that was already understood under international law to be, in fact, actually illegal. The fact that powerful states had been doing it for a while is another matter. But under international law, the idea that you could actually, let's say if someone in a particular area commits a crime, that you could then penalize the entire community, right? The whole idea of collective punishment. Or that if somebody had taken refuge, someone who was accused of a crime had taken refuge in a certain community in a certain village, and then the villagers refused to hand him over, then what the Frontier Crimes Regulation did was it enabled the British to actually impose fines on the entire community, right? So this is what the Frontier Crimes Regulation is. And the reason it is important is because it underscores the fact that this frontier region was viewed as a region that could not be tamed. It could not be domesticated. And of course, the supposition was that you were really dealing with people who were in a manner of speaking savage or wild. Right? The anthropologist James Scott has offered another formulation, which is, I think, a very important formulation, which helps us understand the distinction between settled districts and tribal areas. And that formulation is where he distinguishes between what he calls state versus non-state spaces. So the non-state spaces, that would be the tribal areas there. Non-state, in a manner of speaking, the entire frontier was really a non-state space compared to the rest of British India. But then within the frontier, the tribal area, as opposed to the settled districts, was viewed as a non-state space, meaning that the writ of the state really didn't run there. You see, so there's a kind of on the one hand, you have the Frontier Crimes Regulation, which is intended to make the writ of the state run. But the point was that it had to be imposed precisely because this area had not yet entered into the vision of the state. It hadn't been mapped, both literally and metaphorically, right? So this is a situation in this part of British India. There's a border is established with Afghanistan, Durand Line in 1893. You have a Pashtun rebellion 1897-98, which is going to be accompanied by enormous repression. And what is called the Northwest Frontier Province was in fact actually shaped by Curzon, the Viceroy of India in 1901. We will get back to this question of the aerial bombing of Masood and Wazir villages, that is villages in Waziristan, and the Third Afghan War is important, but I will advert to it later on and you will understand the context of my intervention over here. To give you an illustration of how the British thought about this part of British India. So you have Sir Neville Chamberlain, who is the commander of the Punjab Frontier Force, writing in a dispatch to London in 1859. to have to carry destruction, if not destitution, into the homes of some hundreds of families is a great drawback of border warfare. But with savage tribes to whom there is no right but might, the only course open as regards humanity as well as policy is to make all suffer, to make all suffer, right? If objection be taken to the nature of punishment inflicted as repugnant to civilization, the answer is that savages cannot be met and checked by civilized warfare, and that to spare their houses and crops would be to leave them unpunished and therefore unrestrained. In short, civilized warfare is inapplicable. And of course, I mean, at this point, I want to raise, at this juncture, I want to raise this one question, which is that, you know, we are aware of the circumstances under which Gandhi carried out the policy of Satyagraha. And policy is not the right word, of course, for Satyagraha, because Satyagraha is not simply a way in which one offers resistance, mass nonviolent resistance or individual nonviolent resistance. Satyagraha, the bedrock of it is ahimsa and satya. And ahimsa for Mohandas Gandhi as for Ghaffar Khan, and I think it's the only other person in India besides Gandhi for whom it can be said, at least among the political leadership, who thinks in that way. For both of them, this was a way of being in the world. It wasn't simply a policy or a strategy or a method of resistance, right? Now, I mention it in this particular context because what I seek to put into question is, can one say that the challenge for Ghaffar Khan is going to be all the greater given the backdrop against which he has to now work with the idea of ahimsa, which is what he sought to do. The Northwest frontier was characterized by the tradition of the Punitive Expedition. I've given some details here, which I'm going to leave aside, but I think you now have some intimation of what I mean by the Punitive Expedition. And that's, of course, the idea that, you know, this is not civilized warfare with these people because they don't really understand that particular language. And the British view was that we are free to burn their villages, burn their crops, impose collective fines. And moving into the 20th century, when the technologies of extermination, the technologies of warfare have become, of course, much more complex, bomb these areas. Right? One of the places that witnessed constant bombing from the air was the Northwest frontier province. We must understand that this is not something that the British did in the rest of India. The only exception, singular exception to that is the Punjab disturbances for a very short period of time in 1919, right? But in the Northwest frontier province, dropping bombs on villages was not uncommon when that technology became available. And some of you might remember George Orwell's marvelous essay on politics and the English language, where he says the British described it as pacification, that when you drop bombs on villages, you call this pacification. Because here, of course, he was talking about the extraordinary abuse of the language. One of the technologies that comes into play in the Northwest frontier province was the machine gun. This is the Maxim gun. I can talk about the Maxim gun for considerable length because there is a wonderful book called The Social History of the Machine Gun, which I have used in some of my work, and I've often assigned a chapter or two from that book to my students. It made an enormous difference because what the Maxim gun did was it introduced an extraordinary asymmetry. This is, of course, increasingly the nature of modern warfare, the asymmetry. The Israelis have they can strafe villages, Palestinian villages from the air. They have the most sophisticated weapons. And what do the Palestinians do? What was the symbol of the Intifada? The symbol of the Intifada was the boys, young boys and young men throwing stones, right? That's the asymmetry. And that's what the Maxim gun really did. Hilaire Belloc writes a poem I shall never forget the way he's saying that blood stood upon this awful day. He's celebrating this gun, the machine gun, and the asymmetry. Preserved us all from death. He stood upon a little mount. This is a British general. Cast his lethargic eyes around and said beneath his breath, whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not, right? That is what you're seeing here. This is a regiment, a British regiment with the Maxim gun. This is a photograph from about 1870, right? Now, I want to move into the question of the Pathan. How does one think about the Pathan, right? That is my fundamental concern over here. But if you look at this photograph, this is a photograph of Khyber chiefs and Khans taken at the northwest frontier. Remember that it's not the northwest frontier province yet. Taken there in 1878. It's a photograph during the Second Afghan War by John Burke. And one of the most arresting things about this, of course, this is something you'll find in virtually every photograph of the Pathans, is the rifle. So if you look here, most of them are sporting a rifle over here. This is part of, as we shall see, the ethos of what it means to be a Pathan. This photograph over here, so these are photographs. They're in the collection of the National Army Museum in London. This is a photograph which was taken in 1919 of a Waziri tribesman with his rifle. All right. So if we were to do an elementary anthropology of the Pathan, supposedly an anthropology, every book that has been written on the Pathans would talk about this. I will mention it very briefly, not because I think that that we need to replicate, obviously, a certain understanding of the Pathan that has been around for a very substantial period of time. I think it is also the case that many of these terms that have been invoked to refer to the character of the Pathan, to think about the codes that animated their lives, I don't think we need to necessarily disavow this language. We need to understand how the Khudai Khidmatgars may have reworked some of this language, right? And that is why I think we'll have to understand what some of the Pakhtunwali, that is the unwritten code of the Pathan, what were its constitutive elements. And here I'm not giving a full-blown account because some might say that a full-blown account would have to include terms such as the jirga, the gathering of the elders, right? The gathering of the elders charged with making certain kinds of decisions. It may have to include, for example, the idea of parda, the seclusion of women. But the question here is not to offer you a full-blown account, as I've said, but to look at 2 or 3 elements which are going to be fundamentally important for the argument that I want to make, because momentarily now from this, I will come to the figure of Ghaffar Khan and what he did and the Khudai Khidmatgars. So there is badla, the code of revenge. What did this really mean? So you have the testimony of Reverend T.L. Pennell, who ran a missionary hospital in the 1890s on the frontier. And he says in his book called Among the Wild Tribes of the Frontier, 1909, revenge is a word sweet to the Pathan ear. And even a revenge satisfied by the culminating murder is the sweeter if the fatal blow, preferably on some dark night, is managed, that the murdered man has a few minutes of life in which to realize that he has been outwitted, right? You don't really want to inflict death on a person and not have him know that this is coming from revenge, right? This is coming from revenge. There are all kinds of stories that are told. I mean, one of the stories that I've read in many of these colonial ethnographies is a story of a man who had been blinded. And he, in desperation, he goes to a doctor and he says, doctor, can you just restore my eyesight to me just for one day? Because that one day is all I need to kill this man and get my revenge. And he says, after that, if I become blind again the rest of my life, I don't mind. Right? These are the kinds of stories that are told. And the point here is not whether they're apocryphal or true. The point is that they are part of a certain kind of common sense that develops around the figure of the Pathan. And then there is, of course, the code of hospitality, right? The honorable, which can also be discussed as the honorable use of material goods, the code of hospitality. I shall dwell on that for a moment. And I want to share with you a couple of descriptions first of badla. Another description, this is by Ghani Khan, who is Ghaffar Khan's oldest son, who in a small book that he wrote on the Pathans, a sketch, first published in the 1940s, reprinted in 1990, gives a picture of what is involved. He says, if dishonored, the Pathan must shoot. He has no alternative. If he does not, his brothers will look down upon him. His father will sneer at him. His sister will avoid his eyes. His wife will be insolent. And his friends will cut him off. One day he goes out and never comes back. He has laughed his way into a bullet that was fired by another of his own blood and race. His wife inherits from him a moment of joy, 2 sons, and a lifetime of sorrow. It's a very poignant description, a very arresting description. But let me turn to the code of hospitality. The incident that I want to describe to you here is mentioned by Rabindranath Tagore when he was on a lecture tour in China. So 1923, 1924, he gave a series of lectures in China. And in the course of one of these lectures, he's discussing the idea of dharma, right? What it means in Indian civilization. And he's also discussing what he views as an ethos of hospitality. So he describes something that happened in 1919. This is where we go back to that slide. Just take your mind back to the slide I shared with you a few minutes ago when I was talking about the aerial bombing of Masood and Wazir villages. And what he's describing is the bombing of a village, of a Masood village, which was in rebellion. Now, this village had been bombed by the air, but the aircraft itself caught fire. And it came crashing down. And when it lands, the pilot and the co-pilot, they try to extricate themselves from this burning aircraft before it blows up. Now, the very villagers whose houses these men had bombed just moments ago, whose crops had been destroyed, they helped them get out of this burning aircraft, take them to safety, nurse them, and then escort them to the border so that they can leave the frontier and get back into the rest of British India. Right? And so Tagore is attempting to explain to his audience how one would understand this phenomenon. Right? According to Masood, he says, hospitality is a quality by which he is known as a man, and therefore he cannot afford to miss his opportunity, even when dealing with someone who can be systematically relentless in enmity. From the practical point of view, the Masood pays for this very dearly, as we must always pay for that which we hold most valuable. It is the mission of civilization to set for us the right standard of valuation. The Masood may have many faults for which he should be held accountable, but that which has imparted for him more value to hospitality than to revenge. Right? I can't read the last line here because I have the screen over there in front of me. So let me see if I can just quickly dig this out. Yeah, so may not, but that which has imparted for him more value to hospitality than to revenge may not be called progress, but is certainly civilization. Now, I want to suggest to you, so how is it that someone like Ghaffar Khan, I want to anticipate what I'm going to say now on Ghaffar Khan and the Khudai Khidmatgars. How is this idea of hospitality used to further the idea of ahimsa? Because what does ahimsa really mean for someone like Gandhi and for Ghaffar Khan? It means, of course, in the very first instance, that you have to be hospitable to your opponent. In fact, you don't have an enemy. I mean, as far as I'm aware, I don't think the word enemy appears in the lexicon of ahimsa, certainly not in the lexicon of Mohandas Gandhi or even Ghaffar Khan. But it means that the self has to be hospitable for. You have to host the other that you wish to repel, right? It means you have to host the otherness of the other within yourself. This is, in fact, what ahimsa is, and this is what the ethos of hospitality means in this code. It's a very exacting standard, right? And this is what I'm referring to here, melmastia, code of hospitality. We won't get into the rest of this elementary anthropology 101 as I've described it. You can even simplify it further now if you had to, in the more colloquial understanding, because in the more colloquial view, it meant that the trifecta of women, land, and guns supposedly defined the Pathan, right? You can think about badla, you can think about the code, but if you had to look at it in a very different language, then what is it? What is anthropology one tell us about the Pathan according to the common sense understanding of Pathan culture? If he had guns, land, and women around him, that is all a Pathan required, and that was a summation of his honor. In 1996, the scholar D. Edwards writes a doctoral dissertation on the Pathans, where he says, without women in his home, without land to his name, without a rifle to shoulder, a man is weightless and naked. And you could say that Gandhi, in some ways, echoes that, and yet, of course, we're going to see that he has a very different view. So in an article that he writes for Harijan Sevak on 20th July 1940, he wrote, this article is written in Hindi, Pathan to talwar banduk saath lekar paida hue hain, aisa kaha ja sakta hai. The Pathan is, right, it can be said that the Pathan is born with a sword and a gun by his side. That and this is the issue of Harijan Sevak, in which this appears. This is a line right here where my cursor is. Pathan to talwar banduk saath lekar paida hue hain, aisa kaha ja sakta hai. Yet, of course, the same Gandhi who is going to say much later on that such men who would have killed a human being with no more thought than they would kill a sheep or a hen should, at the bidding of one man, have laid down their arms and accepted nonviolence as the superior weapon, sounds almost like a fairy tale. And this, of course, brings me to Ghaffar Khan, the Khudai Khidmatgars in greater detail now. So, don't really have the time here to get into his biography. It needs to be said that Ghaffar Khan remained committed to the idea of education for his entire adult life. In the Northwest frontier, in 1891, there were only 15 matriculates. Only 15 matriculates. This number had gone up to 71 in 1903. Schooling was viewed really as unmanly. Parents didn't want to send their schools to government schools to begin with, because these schools were viewed as imparting secular education. Although I think that the more correct understanding is that the mullahs essentially instruct their parents that you must not send your children to schools, because of course one of the things that did was that a schooling might of course be detrimental to the authority of the mullah himself. The medium of instruction, by the way, in schools was Urdu, and it was going to be one of Ghaffar Khan's missions to ensure that schooling in that region would eventually be in Pashto as well, right? He establishes his own first school at Utmanzai in 1910. So he was 20 years old. Ghaffar Khan is born in 1890, as was mentioned in the introduction, and dies in 1988. But he established his first school in 1910. And it is said that by 1918, and the period especially between 1915 and 18, during the course of World War I, he had visited approximately 500 villages in the settled districts of the frontier. And in 70 of these, he had established schools by the mid-1920s. All right. His early initiation into nationalist politics and Muslim intellectual life, this is the period between 1915 and 1921. He can be described in the following terms: that he pays a number of visits to the famous Islamic seminary at Deoband. One of the things, of course, if we were doing once again of full-fledged account, we would have to understand the particular way in which he gets initiated into what can be described as Congress politics. Gandhi had arrived on the Indian political scene in 1919. On the national Indian political scene, it arrived, of course, in India in early 1915 from South Africa, but he becomes part of what we might describe as the national scene by 1919. And then, of course, by 1920-21, he is nearly the undisputed leader and the architect of the struggle for independence. But in 1920, this period here, in 1919, when Gandhi had called for a nationwide hartal, this hartal was observed in Peshawar as well. In fact, the Pathans convene in Ghaffar Khan's village, and the village is going to be punished as a consequence. Ghaffar Khan's father, Bayram, who was a landowner, is going to be more or less taken hostage, and this is going to be the first prison term that he's going to serve. Ghaffar Khan is going to be sentenced to 6 months rigorous imprisonment. Ghaffar Khan, let me say at this moment, is going to spend roughly a third of his entire life in jail. And for those of you who are unaware, he spent at least as many years in jail after independence, jailed by the government of Pakistan as he did before independence, when he was jailed by the government of British India. Right? So 1920, Ghaffar Khan is going to attend the Khilafat conference in Delhi. And he's then going to engage in hijrat or flight to Afghanistan as part of the Khilafat protest, something that he later argued was a mistake. But I'm going to omit all of this here in the interest of time. What is very clear is that by early 1920, he had decided that neither hijrat nor jihad offered the route to the transformation of society. And he writes, okay, so when I say he writes, this is what has been dictated in his autobiography. I realized that revolution could not be done in a hurry and that it was no easy task. It needed sensible and intelligent people. People needed to be politically educated and needed a certain dedication. And he says, I decided to go back to my village and adopt the path of nonviolence. Now, he has not met Gandhi at this point, though. I mean, he's well aware of Gandhi. We know this from a large number of sources, and we know this from a number of episodes of his life. Right? But he hasn't met Gandhi. He's not going to meet him until 1929. I decided that I would open madrasas for education for the reform of the bad customs among Pathans and to stop them from violence, to inspire a love for their country. And he founds a society for the reform of the Afghans in 1921. And what you're going to find here, what is really, I think, most interesting, because again, this is something that can really only be said of Ghaffar Khan, is his proximity to Gandhi with respect to the idea of the constructive program. Gandhi had put forward a constructive program. It is not an accident that down to the present day, the vast majority of biographies do not talk much about the constructive program. They talk about the salt Satyagraha. They talk about the non-cooperation movement, the political trial of Gandhi, the Quit India movement. They talk about that which is performative, that which becomes spectacular. But of course, from Gandhi's own point of view, and this is exactly what can be said of Badshah Khan, right? It is, in fact, the elementary things, the cleaning of latrines, keeping villages clean, all of which Badshah Khan is going to insist upon when he starts his program of social reform. All of this has really been largely occluded, right? Largely occluded. Now, when it is in the immediate aftermath of the founding of the society, with his emphasis on social reform, with his emphasis on education, that the British declared this work to be subversive. Well, that's astonishing if you think of it, right? Because certainly they would not have laid that charge against Gandhi in British India doing the same kind of work. But the supposition was that in the frontier, which is really beyond the pale, this is in fact subversive work. And so he's going to be arrested and sentenced to 3 years rigorous imprisonment. And I want to speak just very briefly about his 3 years in jail, because it appears to me that the biographers haven't quite yet understood what the significance of his 3 years in jail were. And we don't have to visit the entire history of how he ended up at Dera Ghazi Khan, which is in the Punjab. You know, there's another jail that he's first moved to, and then he's moved to this particular jail. And some of you are well aware of the fact that people like Gandhi, Mandela, Reverend James Lawson, many architects of the civil rights movement, many people who were involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and all over the world, those who have spent terms in prison have often reflected on the jail as a kind of a university, right? A place for self-reflection, a place where you talk to other political prisoners, especially if you're placed with other political prisoners, a place where you get educated. The jail is a perfect institution for the autodidact, right? Now, in this jail, many of the prisoners were Akalis who were imprisoned for political offenses, because at that time there was what was called the Gurdwara reform movement. Right? And you can see that what is happening there is somewhat analogous to what Badshah Khan, Ghaffar Khan, is attempting to do in the frontier, where he was absolutely clear that the mullahs had to be completely kept out of these social reform movements. Right? The mullahs were not going to be permitted to influence the course of education, for example. Because what Ghaffar Khan is really suggesting here is that these people actually obscure the path of knowledge for those who are eager, those who are hungry for knowledge. Right? And what the Akalis were suggesting, of course, because you have to really know what the Gurdwara reform movement is, but the priests at these Gurdwaras were at this point appointed by the British government. And what the Gurdwara reform movement sought to do was to liberate these Gurdwaras from colonial rule and from the stranglehold that these priests had, right? So it is in this jail that he actually acquires a real familiarity with not only what one might describe as, you know, the religion of the Sikhs and all of that, but he acquires a fuller understanding of what the nature of a political offense is, so to speak, and what are some of the obstacles that exist in the way of social reform. Right? In the autobiography, the deep impression that the jail experience had upon him, he talks about that. Right? Now, moving into the next section, which is the formation of the Khudai Khidmatgars, and I have a number of slides here which I'm going to simply omit here, but this is really can be seen as a kind of a preface to that particular section, or to the last part of the talk that I really want to look at in some detail. Let's just pause to think about what the British view of the frontier and of Ghaffar Khan is. The Daily Mail, I've deliberately not given a date on this, because this can be described as kind of a view over a course of several decades. When we get to the very end, you will see that I'm going to give you some newspaper accounts to see how the British were thinking about Ghaffar Khan, the Khudai Khidmatgars, and there you will see specific dates. But the Daily Mail said that the frontier is an outpost of the Soviet Republic and the spearhead of an attack on India. It claimed that Russian gold is pouring in across the Khyber Pass and Muslims are being armed with the Russian weapons. Their leader, it is said of the Pathans, is the terrible Abdul Ghaffar Khan, a jailbird and relentless enemy of the British. All right. Now, the Khudai Khidmatgars. So, Ghaffar Khan had founded a society. I described it very briefly, the Anjuman Society, but in 1921. But its activities had not inculcated from his standpoint a sufficient sense of self-sacrifice and self-restraint. He wanted to introduce a notion of seva. I think that this is something, by the way, that in part he learned from his close proximity to the Sikhs in jail over a period of 3 years. The idea of seva is critical to Sikhism. What he sought to do was to transform the egocentrism that is behind the personal feud. Because what informs the life of the Pathan? It's the code of revenge, right? I've given a number of quotations. Now he wants to transform the egocentrism that is behind this into a kind of a self-restraint. So on the one hand, he's interested in schooling and society. He's interested in the fact that the Pathans do not display the kind of unity that he thinks is critically important to creating a nation of Pathans, a Pakhtunistan, right? He seeks solidarity, and he believes that the element of service is very important. Now he says that God doesn't require any service. The best way one can do service is to serve others, right? And it is in this context that he is going to found in late November 1929, it might have been a month or two earlier, an organization called the Khudai Khidmatgars, the Servants of God. This organization embodied the intensification of social activism, but also became an organization for political protest and agitation. And it is this same year in Lucknow that Ghaffar Khan meets Gandhi for the first time. There are many versions of the oath. There is something that is, of course, similar to all of them, but we don't have a written document which suggests that, that this is what the oath was at the very beginning. What we have is we have various oral accounts that have been furnished of what the oath was, and the gist of it, and I'm taking here the version that appears in what is perhaps, I think, at least down to the present day, the best scholarly book on the Khudai Khidmatgars, a book by Mukulika Banerjee called The Pathan Unarmed. And this appears, this oath, the text of the oath as I've replicated it, it appears in this book. In the name of God who is present and evident, I am a Khudai Khidmatgar. I will serve the nation without any self-restraint. I will not take revenge. And my actions will not be a burden for anyone. My actions will be non-violent. I will make every sacrifice required of me to stay on this path. I will serve people without regard to their religion or faith. I shall use nation-made goods, Swadeshi, right? I shall not be tempted by any office. Of course, this also suggests why he also disavowed power and the attractions of political office. But notice one thing, the most visible thing. This would be my response to those who characterize Ghaffar Khan as a Muslim nationalist or someone who's agitating for a kind of a Muslim nationalism. There is no reference to Islam, nor is this oath only restricted to Muslims. None at all. Right? I think this is critically important when we're looking at the oath. Now, a nexus is going to be formed between the Khudai Khidmatgars, the KK, and the Congress very early on. The organization, as I said, is founded in 1929. You know, if you look at the bottom of this slide, Wali Khan, who is Ghaffar Khan's second son, suggested a deeper nexus, one that actually explains the very origins of the Khudai Khidmatgars. And I'm not certain that I necessarily subscribe to this view, but this is the view that he gives. The Indian National Congress held its annual session in December 1929 in Lahore. Given the proximity of Lahore to the Northwest Frontier Province, comparatively speaking, at least in comparison to Calcutta, of course, and Nagpur and so on, there was a very substantial Pathan presence. There were also Pathan women. So he writes that Bacha Khan called a Loya Jirga in Utmanzai. It was decided at the Jirga that an organization of volunteers should be established. Its members would have to wear a uniform. Thus, an organization under the title of Khudai Khidmatgar came into being in October 1929. Whether it was formed in October 1929 or November 1929, the critical point here is that Wali Khan is suggesting that this nexus between the KK and the Indian National Congress was much deeper, because it was in fact actually at the annual meeting of the Congress that he receives his inspiration. I think that this can be disputed. What are the circumstances under which the Khudai Khidmatgar actually was founded, right? But what is certainly very clear, indisputably clear, is that in early 1930, the Peshawar Congress Committee announced that Ghaffar Khan and the Khudai Khidmatgars would be allied with the Congress in the forthcoming civil disobedience campaign, right? And the implications of this were understood very clearly by the British, because they point out that the KK is in fact actually essentially calling for the same things that the Congress is calling for: boycott of government servants, frequent references to the boycott of foreign cloth, the use of khadar, and so on. And here you see a photograph which only points to the close relationship that, of course, Ghaffar Khan had with the Congress. And he was a member, of course, of the Congress Working Committee. He was one of the few members of the Congress Working Committee who voted against the partition plan in 1947. You see Nehru next to him over here, Sarojini Naidu, various other leaders that you can recognize. All right. The Kissa Quanim massacre, Kissa Kahani, really, because it's a storyteller's bazaar. This is in Peshawar. This massacre takes place on 23rd April 1930. This episode is of critical importance in trying to understand the history of two things. One, the history of the Khudai Khidmatgars. The other is the problematic of the representation of the KK in colonial texts, right? So this incident takes place on 23rd April 1930. Just a few days before this incident, the Congress had sent an inquiry committee. The Congress had sent an inquiry committee. So I want to make sure that people understand that I'm not speaking of an inquiry committee appointed in the aftermath of the massacre. There was a committee for that purpose too. What I'm speaking about is a Congress inquiry committee that had attempted to enter Peshawar, was prevented from doing so before the massacre. 2-3 days before the massacre, the committee had come there to look into the repressions that were taking place in the frontier province. Okay, but Ghaffar Khan and various other people in the organization had repeatedly told the Congress that there is enormous repression being undertaken here, and the Congress decided that they were going to investigate this. Now, the KK had gathered at the Peshawar railway station. The British had sent armored cars and troops. Ghaffar Khan himself and some of his supporters and the KK are going to be arrested. Charges of sedition are going to be placed upon them. Section 144 of the Frontier Crimes Regulation is going to be put into effect. What exactly happened then at the railway station on 23rd April 1930, and more importantly, at the bazaar? This is going to be the subject of two separate inquiries, one which is an official inquiry committee and one an inquiry committee appointed by the Indian National Congress. All right. And it is unnecessary for me to enter into the details. There are some aspects of it which are enormously interesting, such as that this is one of the rare instances where an Indian regiment, the Garhwal regiment, in fact, actually refused to carry out orders to fire on the crowd. The British represented this essentially, and this is what I'm going to turn to my attention to in the next few minutes before I wind up, because I realize that I've gone on for a little over an hour already, and I want to leave some time for questions and answers. What is important here is the representation, as I said, of what happens here in this bazaar. The British reports mention 20 dead. It has been established a long time ago. In fact, the Congress Inquiry Committee itself established that at least 200, 300 people were killed, a large number of whom were people belonging to the Khudai Khidmatgars, others as well. And we're going to find that in the wake of this, Ghaffar Khan is once again going to be sent to jail. Their numbers are going to grow, the KK. By early 1930, there were about 1,000 people. By 1931, they had 25,000 members. At the height of their membership, they had about perhaps 100,000 members or volunteers. All right. This here is a description, and this is the key. I want to dwell on this for a moment. This is a description given by Gene Sharp of what happened at the Qissa Kahani Bazaar. I want to read it out. I want those of you who are familiar with what happened during the salt satyagraha, particularly, and here I refer not so much to Gandhi breaking the salt, but I refer to, because the salt satyagraha, of course, is a reference not just to what Gandhi did when he undertook the long march and arrived at Dandi and then broke the salt law. The salt satyagraha refers to the thousands of such incidents of breaking the salt law that happened in the aftermath for months, and tens of thousands of Indians placed in jail. But in particular, I want to call your attention to, remind you of the raid on the Darshana salt works, right? The raid on the Darshana salt works initiated under the leadership of Sarojini Naidu. And we have a number of firsthand accounts, number of witnesses, including Webb Miller, who gave an account that what happened, a row of congressmen, congresswomen would march up and the police would whack them with their lathis. And you could hear the lathi coming down on a skull. You would hear the skull cracking. Webb Miller gave this graphic account. And then there would be these volunteers who would come, right, and take these people who had been wounded away, and then a next wave of volunteers would come, and they would be beaten in turn, and a third wave, and a fourth wave, and a fifth wave, and so on and so forth. And that transformed the world. That was the account. Now, this is what Gene Sharp says over here at Qissa Kahani Bazaar. When those in front fell down wounded by the shots. This is a dramatically different account of what you read in the newspapers. And when I'm talking about newspapers, I'm talking about the British newspapers, because Indian newspapers couldn't report on this. Completely censored. When those in front fell down wounded by the shots, those behind came forward with their breasts bared and exposed themselves to the fire. So much so that some people got as many as 21 bullet wounds in their bodies. And all the people stood their ground without getting into a panic. A young Sikh boy came and stood in front of a soldier and asked him to fire at him, which the soldier unhesitatingly did, killing him. The crowd kept standing at the spot facing the soldiers and were fired at from time to time until there were heaps of wounded and dying lying about. And then Gene Sharp continues, the Anglo-Indian paper of Lahore, which represents the official view, itself wrote to the effect that the people came forward one after another to face the firing, and when they fell wounded, they were dragged back and others came forward to be shot at. This state of things continued from 11 till 5 o'clock in the evening. When the number of corpses became too many, the ambulance corps of the government took them away. Right? And so then you might think to yourself, so why shouldn't we simply view what the Khudai Khidmatgars were doing as something identical to what was done at the Darshana sort works? And I think this is why I think the Khudai Khidmatgar is interesting, because what Ghaffar Khan had envisioned was a non-violent army. It would have a military structure, and the Khudai Khidmatgars did. This was not a one-off thing. This is not like the Darshana salt works, which is a one-off thing. Okay, this is what you do when you raid the Darshana salt works. What Ghaffar Khan is thinking of is literally a standing army with a military structure, but it will be completely committed to the idea of non-violence. And the Khudai Khidmatgars, much like a regular army, would have marches. They had their own army band, bugles and drums. They had a uniform. They're called the red shirts. There's a lot of literature that has been written around the red shirts. I mean, the color red, of course, also from the point of view of the British, it was very handy because they could simply associate it with communism, with the Bolsheviks, right? But there is a military structure to the Khudai Khidmatgars. There is a tiered leadership. And yet there is a certain kind of democracy, right? And I raise this idea. This idea, I think, is extraordinarily interesting for us, because as we think of the ease with which the nation state constantly enters into the domain of war, right? Down to our present day. What will be the future of ahimsa? What will be the future of nonviolence? And I think in this respect, I want to suggest that Ghaffar Khan took us further along the road in thinking about what we might describe as a formal military structured army committed to the principles of nonviolence. Now I'm going to just have to omit all of this because as I said, in the interest of time, I have to omit all of these. These are newspaper accounts from The Guardian, 6 May 1930, which will suggest all of these newspaper accounts that I'm going to just quickly show you in a minute. The attempt to say that, well, the KK has no autonomy of its own. The Khudai Khidmatgars have been purely influenced by the Congress. So this is the old argument that is always used in every nation state to delegitimize political protests. You say outsiders have come in. They're the ones who are responsible. Here the argument is that the Congress really are outsiders. And then furthermore, of course, the idea is that we also have communist influence here. This is the old argument that the virile Muslim, right? When the weaker peoples of the frontier, like the Hindus, realize that the British are the only force that stand between them and the virile Muslim, who is particularly in the frontier likely to get completely out of hand, right? And you can see the comedy here. This is an article that is published in the Times of India, which was a British-owned newspaper at that time. And it's the same Times of India that we have today, but of course it's a very different newspaper, and this was a British-owned newspaper. Fierce attacks on armored cars. It's not the armored cars who are attacking the crowds, it's the armored car that is being attacked by a crowd that has no guns. If you read the entire article, you know, what are they attacking these armored cars with, right? And the whole attempt to represent the KK as a menace. This is from The Guardian, 28 December 1931. So we have moved from the massacre at the bazaar in April 1930, 28 December 1931, because this is a period of extraordinary repression for the entire period. And when Gandhi, in fact, had gone to London for the Roundtable Conference, the frontier government used that as a pretext at that point to unleash even more repression, right? Okay, so these are some of the headlines from these newspapers. Troops open fire, so 28 December 1931, on riotous red shirts near Kohat. And this is a photograph here, of course, of Ghaffar Khan, suggesting that he is really basically acting solely under the influence of Gandhi, solely under the influence of Gandhi. All right, so now moving to my conclusion then. When we think about the Khudai Khidmatgars, think of the character of the Pathan. What were some of the hindrances to the creation of this organization? Nonetheless, it was there. And I think that its history from 1930 to 1947 is a history that hasn't fully yet been written. Most of this history really pertains to the period 1930-1931, with occasional forays into the late 1930s, early 1940s. But there were difficulties. And hindrances, there was the whole idea of the character of the Pathan, which is that the Pathan is inimical to this kind of discipline. The Pathan is ferociously individual, ferociously individual. What an army, albeit a non-violent army, requires discipline, structure, hierarchy. Right? The Pathan is liable to act at his own will. The code of revenge is critically important for him. Unlike in India, where you had in the rest of British India, where you had the Firearms Act, and availability of firearms was a real difficulty. And the frontier, arms were easily available. There is a culture of the rifle. But there are other considerations too. Much of the work that is enjoined by Ghaffar Khan upon the Khudai Khidmatgar members or volunteers was viewed by some of them initially as emasculating. As one KK member stated in 1992, so there are a set of interviews that Mulika Banerjee did in her book, The Pathan Unarmed, and these quotes, these interviews refer to those interviews that she did. There was a lot of propaganda, as one KK member said in 1992, saying that it was a woman's job to spin thread, right? And you will see over here that this is what Ghaffar Khan is doing. So, we can also get into a detailed discussion of what we might describe as the politics of masculinity and femininity that we would really have to think about when we are thinking of what the KK were involved with. There was, of course, very heavy British propaganda that the red shirts were communists. And this was, of course, a real obstacle for the KK because involvement in communist activity was an invitation to get picked up by the police state and be taken into custody. The remoteness of the frontier and the frontier crime regulation meant that repression was extraordinarily severe. So the penalties that attached to people who joined the KK were extraordinarily severe, especially if the government found a pretext to repress them. Right? So we can omit this now because I think you have some sense of what I've been describing as the colonial view of the Pathan and the Afridis, the infantilism, the capriciousness of the Pathan, and all of that, right? And this here is a little sort of a clip which again speaks about the purported association of the red shirts with Bolshevism, which is really frankly laughable. The idea that the KK were in any way really involved with communism, but this is certainly an attempt that was often made, right? And if we had to do a systematic history that would take us to the very end, of course, I think we would have to understand Ghaffar Khan's relationship to Pakistan. Because one of the things I pointed out, so the Khudai Khidmatgars is essentially dismantled at the time of partition, 1947, fundamentally dismantled. And so its history really is a history from late 1929 to 1947, about 17 years. And some of you may well be aware of the history of what happened, the whole referendum. I won't get into that. If anybody has a question about it, I will be happy to address it. Some final concluding thoughts. Ghaffar Khan was a figure of subordinate rather than elite politics. Right? I think that is the most fundamental thing. And this takes me back to where I had started when I was describing the various ways in which he is an anomalous figure. okay, in the history of Indian nationalism and Muslim nationalism. His explicit disavowal of politics and the trappings of power ensured that he would remain marginal in colonial India and independent Pakistan alike. One of the reasons why he has been invoked by some people, I have some misgivings about this question. But one of the reasons why his name has been invoked is because he has been put forward as an illustration of the good Muslim. This takes us back to that whole opposition of the good Muslim versus the bad Muslim, which is a template of thought that has became very dominant, particularly in the aftermath of the September 11th bombings in the United States, where, of course, Islam was going to be demonized. And the reason I say I have some misgivings is that some scholars have suggested Ghaffar Khan should be championed, should be invoked, because he shows that Islam also has a tradition of nonviolence. And I have some misgivings about it, not because I think that this is not the case. My misgivings are that I don't think the onus is on Islam to show, Islam in particular, to show that it has the space for nonviolence within it. I find this attitude a little bit patronizing, right? And that's what my misgiving is. And recall what I also said, that we would have to seriously put into question the idea that Ghaffar Khan, who really was a devout Muslim, that he actually thought and acted on behalf of the Pathans as a Muslim. I think that we would have to seriously question that proposition as well. Right? Ghaffar Khan leads us to a renewed understanding of the power of nonviolence and the intricate relationship of violence to nonviolence. By this, I mean, of course, that the fact that it was the Pathan who was capable of becoming a volunteer of the Khudai Khidmatgars, and everything that we know about the KK suggests the extraordinary discipline they exercised over the course of 17 years. I'm certain that there were lapses, as there have to be, right? But is it the propensity of the Pathan to violence, which also gives him dialectically the propensity to nonviolence in the most rigorous fashion? I think that this is one of the most fascinating questions that emerges, in particular from a study of Ghaffar Khan and the Khudai Khidmatgars. And of course, we have a kind of a template from Gandhi's own thinking, where he draws a distinction between nonviolence of the strong and nonviolence of the weak. Some scholars have attempted to understand this relationship of violence to nonviolence in the context of Gandhi's own distinction. The idea of an army of nonviolent resistors, as I've suggested, was his most extraordinary insight and remains untested after the demise of the Khudai Khidmatgars. And finally, and I will end with some photographs, I think a full assessment of Ghaffar Khan in relation to Gandhi still remains. I have a number of observations about that, but I think I'll skip them. Here, this is a photograph here which shows Ghaffar Khan. You can see him over here. This is surrounded. You see the Khudai Khidmatgars here, the uniformed men over here. This is an Egyptian delegation that had come to Peshawar in the late 1930s, and shows a crowd. It is very difficult for many people to understand the absolute veneration in which he was held in the frontier region among the Pathans and in Afghanistan as well. A certain kind of mystique that had developed around him. And again, the only analogy really we have here is Gandhi, but of course Gandhi was an India-wide figure and a world historical figure in a way that unfortunately Ghaffar Khan has not been, but should be. All right. I will skip this over here at the moment, because as I said, I just want to end with some photographs very quickly here. I had suggested that we would need to take a long view of the relationship between Gandhi and Ghaffar Khan. These are some extraordinary photographs. Some of them haven't really been published for a while, And these are photographs from 1937 to 1939. These are largely, not entirely. This is an All India Congress Committee meeting photograph from that time. But most of these remaining 4 or 5 photographs are all from the frontier, from Gandhi's visits to the frontier as a guest, of course, of Badshah Khan. And here he is on the frontier mail. You see Gandhi over here is about to board the train. This is the 2 Gandhis addressing a large crowd. Another one here, again from the frontier. And this one is from, in fact, from Ghaffar Khan's hometown. So we end where we began, and Gandhi had in fact visited him there in 1937. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lal. That was a fascinating lecture. To the list of forgotten idols, we had conveniently added the name of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and it is of some recompense that we could listen to you today, sir. It was truly a comprehensive, critical, and informative presentation. Thanks a lot. Sir, shall we move on to the discussion part of the lecture?
Certainly.
Okay.
Yes, and I apologize for the length of it. I just didn't realize. I mean, I know we started quite a bit late, but still it's gone longer than I'd anticipated.
But we were with you, sir. We were really truly enjoying your presentation. Sir, shall I read the questions for you?
Certainly.
These are the questions raised by our audience. This one is from Prantik Banerjee. He asks you this one. Okay, I'll read the question. The ongoing Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav celebrates the contribution of tribals to Indian freedom struggle. Interestingly, the list of tribal leaders includes Munda, Murmu, and many others, but fails to mention Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan's name. So how does mainstream historiography problematize categories such as tribal leader and national tribal leader? What is its effect on the freedom narrative?
Right. Well, this is in fact actually a very interesting question, because the person who has posed it is absolutely correct, that there is an attempt, if I may put it this way, to start recognize the contribution of some of the tribals to India's freedom struggle. Birsa Munda is the person. I mean, so the Munda that is referred to here is Birsa Munda, is obviously the most iconic figure in that attempt. One could say, of course, I mean, I think I'll have to be blunt about it, that I don't think that the present government of India has any real investment in the tribals at all, or in their history or their heritage. I think that this is an attempt, obviously, to try to project itself as a kind of a unifying government which really believes that all Indians partake in the history of the country. I think that one way to answer this question would be to see what the real investment in tribal history, tribal development, tribal culture has been on the part of the government of India. And I'm afraid that the answer there is not a very encouraging one. That's one way to look at it. The other aspect of the question, which I think is intellectually a very interesting question, is where does Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan figure into this? Now, we have to understand that Ghaffar Khan occupies, if I may put it this way, a liminal position. Yes, he comes from the frontier, but he had a very close proximity to the mainstream nationalist movement. The tribals never did. Let's not forget that. The tribals as a whole never did. They never had any real proximity to the mainstream nationalist movement. I mean, you remember some of the photographs I've shown, which show Ghaffar Khan with Nehru, with Sarojini Naidu. There are many such photographs, hundreds of such photographs. He's a member of the Congress Working Committee, right? So this is what I mean by his liminal position, that he's part of the mainstream nationalist tradition. On the other hand, he comes from the frontier. And the frontier, of course, itself was, in a way, a kind of a liminal place. It's on the threshold, right? It can be absorbed into civilization, and yet it cannot be. That is the other view. And of course, there was another view, which is it should not be. It should not be. Remember the one thing that I underscored, and that was the fact that Ghaffar Khan never aspired to what we could describe as a national eminence or a national position or national visibility. The fact that he had it for a period of time owed, of course, very substantially to the proximity that he had, especially to Mohandas Gandhi. Right? So I think that this question is a very arresting one, because it would really require us to think very seriously about the category of the tribal. And of course, the real import of the category has to do with political economy, because the tribals all inhabited areas that were largely areas where the colonial state engaged in extraction, right? But we can also use James Scott's idea to suggest that one of the things that in fact is common between the Mundas and the Pathans, for example, is the fact that to some degree, both of them embody what can be called non-state spaces. Right? So I think a full answer would require an investigation of this kind, but it's a very interesting question.
Thank you, Professor Lal. This one is by Anisa Fatima. Could you tell us how central the Pakhtunwali code is to Pashtuns in contemporary Afghanistan? Do you think the element of revenge is sometimes overstated in narratives as compared to other codes like hospitality?
Oh, well, I mean, there is of course a very substantial literature about contemporary Afghanistan. Much of the, reason, of course, for such a profuse literature has to do with the fact of Afghanistan's place in geopolitical discourses of the present day. Some of these works have attempted to describe whether this code of Pakhtunwali is still holds a place in Afghanistan among the Pathans, especially. We have to remember that, of course, Afghanistan is not only Pathans, there are other groups there as well, the Hazaras and so on. So I think that I'm not sure that I'm really in the position of being able to say something in great detail on this particular question, because it would really require a foray into contemporary scholarship. And I think that the bulk of the works that I have seen about contemporary Afghanistan really are not what I would describe as works in social anthropology. They are more really works which have to do with the contemporary importance of Afghanistan, particularly over the course of the last 4 decades and geopolitical discourses. But I can certainly say this, that when you're looking at the long period of colonial rule, I don't think it would be a mistake to say that the element of revenge or badla is being actually overstated in the narratives. I think that this was very much part of the ethos of that society. I think what is important, from at least from the standpoint from which I spoke, was to attempt to understand how the egocentrism of that is entailed in the personal feud is sought to be transmuted, transformed into something that would become a different kind of force for creating a new society. That is what Ghaffar Khan was attempting to do. And that's what I would like to really focus on.
One second, Krishna ma'am. There is a question from Ajay Singh.
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
Yeah, I see the question here. Why was Ghaffar Khan imprisoned in post-independence Pakistan? And what has been his status and standing been among Pathans? Well, I think his standing among Pathans remains enormous. Let us not forget that when he passed away, 1988, this was in the midst of war, of course, and they called for a ceasefire so that all the Pathans, he actually died in a hospital, if I remember correctly the details, he died in a hospital in Peshawar, but the body was taken to Jalalabad, across the border into Afghanistan, because he had spent the last decade or two of his life in Jalalabad. And so, and in order to ensure that not only simply that his body could be taken, but that the thousands of Pathans who wanted to join the funeral procession could do so, they actually called for a ceasefire, which was almost entirely observed. I mean, there were a few small lapses, but it was really observed. And it was partly because of the enormous stature that he had among his people, right? With respect to the first part of the question, why was he imprisoned? Well, I have that slide, which I had to omit, where I talk about Ghaffar Khan and Pakistan. Okay, and there I discuss what his view was of Pakistan, because let it be said very clearly and unequivocally, absolutely clearly and unequivocally. Number one, Ghaffar Khan remained completely hostile, unreceptive, if one wants to use a slightly gentler word, to the Muslim League. He did not at all agree with the politics that drove the Muslim League. And I think that the first thing to understand about why he came to have the reputation that he did in Pakistan, which sent him into jail constantly over 15 years. In fact, the first 15 of his first 18 years in Pakistan are spent in jail. A good number of those years in solitary confinement. So when Ayub Khan, who was Pakistan's military leader, had Ghaffar Khan arrested and removed to Sindh in April 1961, he gave a press conference on April 12th, where he said, in response to a question as to why Ghaffar Khan had been arrested, he said that Ghaffar Khan had made unreasonable demands. And I quote here, Abdul Ghaffar Khan wanted the frontier area to become a part of India. Having failed in that venture, he demanded a separate province in Pakistan, where he wanted to be the king. This is Ayub Khan saying this. Ayub Khan saying he wanted to be the king. Later, he wanted to make this frontier region a part of Afghanistan. So if you had to put it in a word, in one single word, what was Ghaffar Khan from the point of view of the Pakistani establishment? Traitor. He was a traitor. And what do you do with traitors? You put them away if you don't shoot them dead. This is what the state of Pakistan did. And it is, of course, only much later when his brother, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, or Dr. Khan Sahib, as he was really known, right, who had led the two ministries in 1937 and 1946, when the Congress won elections before independence, and he formed the ministry, and then Dr. Khan Sahib eventually, of course, rose to prominence in the politics of Pakistan itself, right? Now, Ghaffar Khan, of course, never had that standing that his brother did. His brother, by the way, was assassinated. He never had that kind of standing. Right? But I think it is very important to bear in mind that this relationship that Ghaffar Khan had was a relationship of deep suspicion, which he had before independence and which he maintained until the very end. Deep suspicion about the Muslim League, and then, of course, about the state of Pakistan. And he said very clearly that, look, if the Sindhis get Sindh and the Baluchis get Baluchistan, right? That each of these major ethnic groups is getting a state, a province, and the Punjabis get Punjab in Pakistan, why shouldn't the Pashtuns get, or Pakhtuns get Pakhtunistan? Right? So I think that if you take all of that into consideration, it is no surprise at all why he was treated the way that he was in Pakistan. This is the, unfortunately, this is the relentless, unremitting logic of the nation state. Wherever you are in the world, the nation state is the most unforgiving thing. And what the nation state demands is complete loyalty. This is something that Ghaffar Khan could not give. But his loyalties were never just to the idea of Pakhtunistan. I want to make it very clear. From my standpoint, this is my reading. His loyalties were to the higher ethic principles of ahimsa and satya. And this is not compatible with any modern nation state, as the fate of Mohandas Gandhi in India today shows us. Because let us not forget that in some parts of India, it is the assassin of Mohandas Gandhi who is now being celebrated. Right? So I think that that should answer the question that Ajay Singh has asked.
Thank you, sir. This question is being raised by Sahil Shashidharan. Professor Karuna Manthena has talked about the strategic and tactical aspects of non-violence in Gandhi's approach beyond its operations as a belief and way of life. You also mentioned a non-violence of the strong and of the weak in relation to Khan's approach. Could you maybe explain
Yes, I can see the question
more and also consider if there's any strategic or tactical foundations to this shift in Khan's thinking post his imprisonment?
Yes. Yes, I mean, this is a question that calls for a very complex answer. I mean, I'm going to have to try to crystallize it so that I don't go on for 15 minutes in attempting to answer this question. See, there are different ways in which you can tackle it. I'm familiar with the work of Karuna Manthena and what she has written on Gandhi. First consideration is to very briefly look into what we might describe as the politics of sexuality, the politics of masculinity, the politics of femininity. See, it has been argued apropos of Gandhi. This is an argument. Biju had mentioned this, you know, when while I was being introduced, and in his preamble, as it's called, he had mentioned the work of Ashish Nandi. And of course, one of the arguments that Nandi had made in The Intimate Enemy, it's an argument that appears in some other works as well, including his essay called Final Encounter on the Politics of the Assassination of Gandhi. But one of the arguments that he had advanced there was an argument about how Gandhi attempted to, if I may put it this way, free himself of the stranglehold of the colonizer's language. And of course, by that one means not literally only the language, but what one means is the whole conceptual framework that comes with that particular language. Right? And the representation of Indians, particularly Hindus, as effeminate had much to do with the trajectory of Indian nationalism, because Indian nationalism, one principal trajectory was a response to that. Right? And what Nandi wants to suggest is that that response itself was within that same conceptual framework. And it's really only Gandhi who offered a very different framework when he put forward the idea of androgyny. Now, Mukulika Banerjee in her book, The Pathan Unarmed, suggests that this framework, which she likes very much, nonetheless may not actually be particularly productive in the case of the Khudai Khidmatgars. Right? That is to say that a different kind of non-violence of the strong was going to be exemplified there, to go back to the terms of this question. Because the charge of effeminacy was never laid at the hands of the Pathan. But there again, I think we have to do a little bit more nuanced reading of what one understands by masculinity, because masculinity is not muscularity alone. And of course, in some respects, it's not muscularity at all. It has nothing to do with physical strength. It has to do, the Brahmin is the true repository of masculinity in Indian culture. That's what Nandi argues, not the Kshatriya, because the Brahmin is the fount of reasoning. And it is reasoning, which itself is masculine. Now, the Pathan was incapable of reasoning. The Pathan was tempestuous. That was the predominant colonial representation. He's wild, he's tempestuous, right? He doesn't operate in the language of logos at all. So the Pathan is feminine in his own way. But you need a different kind of non-violence of the strong to offset this femininity than the non-violence of the strong that you need among the Hindus, the so-called effeminate Hindus. Right? So this is what I mean when I say that one can get into a very complex trajectory here, because then one might have to delineate between different forms of non-violence of the strong. I mean, the simplest reading of non-violence of the weak and non-violence of the strong, of course, goes back to what happened during the Salt March, because I'm certain that many of you are here aware of the fact that, you know, there were just a little bit less than 80 marchers that accompanied Gandhi. Not one woman, not a single woman was picked. Now, that wasn't because Gandhi didn't know women or because he didn't want women coming into the public sphere, quite to the contrary. I mean, if you read the autobiographies written by women, including Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay most famously, but you know, you read Sarojini Naidu, with any number of women, some of whom are not as well known as the two figures that I've mentioned. But all of them will tell you that one of the things that the non-violent resistance movement did in India was it facilitated the entry of women into the public sphere. And why didn't Gandhi pick a woman? Because he wanted to be quite certain that the British could not argue that the Indians have put women in the march because they want to ensure that they don't get attacked, because the British are too civilized to attack women, right? Of course, that was not the case at all, but that was an important part of the public rhetorical performance. That is to say that the Satyagrahis, right, should never be accused of hiding behind women. The British should never be given the opportunity of saying that. Right? That is the simplest way in which one thinks about the non-violence of the strong versus the non-violence of the weak. But I am suggesting to you, if you go back to my first set of remarks, that there are obviously ways in which one can complicate it, because the very idea of the non-violence of the strong had to be read in a slightly different register in the frontier than it was in the rest of India. Right? So I'll stop over there.
We shall wrap up the session with a small comment that we received from Maria Chakuni on a live chat. She says that the East was split into governable regions by the British, criminality introduced by creating the Frontier Crimes Regulation, a peaceful people pushed into rebellion by repressive policies.
I'm not sure.
You might not be able to read the comments, sir. It's there in our live chat on our YouTube channel.
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay, maybe that's because I think I was looking for it. So could you just repeat it once again?
Yeah, she finds it interesting to note that the East was split. Yeah, the East was split into governable regions by the British.
Yeah.
Criminality introduced by creating the Frontier Crimes Regulation.
Yeah.
a peaceful people is pushed into rebellion by repressive policies.
Yes. Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, I would say that by and large, I agree with that observation. Yes. I mean, the frontier crimes regulation. You know, when you bring forward legislation of this kind, you create the very object of your regulation. Right? That is what is being suggested by the person whose comment you have read, and fundamentally, I would agree with that. Whether they should be called peaceful, you know, that is something, of course, that would be disputed by a lot of people. But again, we would then have to understand what are the registers of peaceful, because the Pathan may go after another person out of the code of revenge. But does he engage in indiscriminate slaughter as a modern nation state does? No. The answer is no, I don't think so, right? So I think we would have to understand, and I think that this, it seems to me that this ascription of peacefulness is coming from that standpoint, that these people are being actually pushed into rebellion by the imposition of what can only be considered the most inhumane pieces of legislation, such as a frontier crimes regulation, which even for those days, I would argue, was a very draconian piece of legislation, you know, right? So the fundamental impulse that animates this question, I agree with. Yes.
Thank you, sir, for graciously answering all the questions. Now I request Dr. Anu Pol, Assistant Professor, Department of English, to propose the vote of thanks. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Christina. A very warm good afternoon. I consider it a privilege to thank the entire community gathered here on the occasion of the International Lecture Series titled Studies in Dissent and Protest, hosted by the Kerala State Higher Education Council, along with Faculty of International Affairs and Research and Post-Graduation Department of English, St. Thomas College, Autonomous, Thrissur. Professor Vinay Lal led us through the topic, the perfect exponent of Satyagraha, Ghaffar Khan and an army of non-violent resistors. His profound research outshone the lecture, and he elucidated the relationship between the tribal society, post-colonial state, also assessing the place of the unsaid in various histories. He has successfully placed Gofar Khan among the stalwarts of non-violence, namely Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, etc. We were honored to listen to your lecture, sir, and wholeheartedly record our gratitude for the intellectually stimulating time we shared together. This initiative by the Kerala State Higher Education Council is a commendable effort in encouraging interactions with well-versed scholars all over the world. I put on record our gratitude for opening such a broad vistas, encouraging socially significant discussions. Our manager, Matani Nilankaval, has always encouraged such intellectual deliberations and marked his presence with laudable enthusiasm. Thank you, His Excellency, for your vibrant inaugural address. It's my pleasure to thank our principal, Dr. Father Martin K., for extending his warm-hearted support for this lecture series. I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Randa Thomas, HOD, Research Department of English, St. Thomas College, for his constant support in all the activities initiated by the department. Dr. C.S. Biju, Dean of International Affairs, set the stage and ambience for the lecture. His enthusiasm to host a program of this magnitude is indeed exceptional, and is an honor to record our gratitude for the same, sir. Thank you, Ms. Christina Tijos, for being the anchor of the day and coordinating the discussion. I acknowledge my gratitude to our technical team for broadcasting the series without much glitches. Last but not the least, I thank our audience, comprising of scholars and students from all over the world, hoping that we could cater to your expectations. We look forward to being with you all in the forthcoming lectures too. Once again, thanking each and everyone who extended their support to make this program an astounding success. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And once again, my apologies to everyone for keeping you a little bit longer than I had anticipated. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lal. Thank you everyone for joining in. We look forward to your continued participation to the upcoming lectures. The next lecture is scheduled on 17th of May, and it will be on the topic Globalizing Protest, a New Architecture of Street Dissent.
Thank you.